Welcome to Manzanita Gold Country Oral History, where we gather with friends and neighbors and talk about the old days. Today we are featuring Kirk Smith from West Point. Kirk, what is your official title?
Self-appointed amateur historian and primarily benefactor of other family members that made and put together extensive collections from the 1800s forward. And so, and then I've grown those collections, so that's why I had a good time with it. So, at any rate, what would you like to know?
I would like to know, first of all, when did you become interested in saving historical documents and photos, all the way back to the 1800s?
Sure. Well, I'd say several things piqued my interest. Starting around 1990, I was in a conversation with my dad about some of his relatives and stuff. I think he hadn't written anything down, but he was talking to me about those things. And I remembered that I had a great uncle that was a lifetime resident of West Point that had put together an album of the history of the town, and had also written a book of the history of the town as he knew it as a kid in the 1800s. And I got a copy of that from my dad and stuff. And I remembered that his daughter had received all, and lived in Chico, and she had received all his papers and pictures. So I found her phone number and went up and retrieved the entire collection from him, which was extensive because it went into all the mining camps. It went into Miwok influence, the Chinese influence on the town, their contribution. And so all these things I was able to gather. So at that point I decided, well, I'd like to expand on this and maybe write a book. So, okay, you know, we're in research phase, we'll call it. And so I start creating indexes of the papers I'm going through, of where buildings are located, when they were built, who had what businesses, who was a miner, what years. And I started creating all these indexes. So I had people, I had gold rush histories, then I had timber histories, then location histories, and then I decided I better do one on Chinese element, and then the Miwok element, and what families were dominant in that community and what their contributions were. So I created all, and I have all that today. I have all these indexes of all this historical data of who's and whens, and it's been kind of fun to collect it. The next part of that was that I had relatives here in San Andreas that related to Judge Smith. And Judge Smith was the first president of the Historical Society of Calaveras County, and my uncle. And I stopped in to descendants of that side of the family, we'll say, and they had boxes and boxes of albums and pictures. Took all that and copied all that. Gave it back to them. You know, if you don't give things back, you get in trouble. So. And that was another big find. And then I also went to my relatives who, on the Smith side in West Point, there were several residents there of Smiths, but this particular gingerbread house was a Thomas Smith place. And it turned out in one of those rooms they had cut out all the newspaper stories over the years of friends who had passed and their histories and pictures. Families in the old days used to trade pictures of their families, and they were all there. And so I got that collection, so that was a big bonus. Also ran across what Judge Smith did in the 30s is he took it upon himself to write every person he knew growing up and said, would you tell me your history?
Oh, wow.
And not all those letters were answered, but every one of them that went out and every one of them that came back were in this one box. So So you could put together these profiles of families of when they showed up and what they contributed to the community, and streets that were named after them, and you'd be able to put it all together in large measure because of what he had gone out and tried to collect. So there's no question those who came back in those days, primarily it seems like in the 30s and 40s, family members really became very conscientious in gathering information and saving it. And I was lucky enough to access it from all the different little corners of the county, so to speak, and family, and put it all in one place.
So what year does most of the history begin that you have, like 1800s, early 1800s, mid 1800s?
So there's no question that the gold rush one really starts right around the beginning of who first came in, people who came in and did mining and formed numerous mining camps in the area.
And what year do you
So
have
you're
a date?
talking 1850, 1851.
1850. Okay.
And so West Point just happened to be a fairly central place to a number of these mining camps in that region of the county. And so what happened is, it turns out an Italian merchant who was over in Rich Gulch went, I think if I set up a store over there, central to where all these little mining camps are, I might do pretty good. So he was the first building in West Point. He just picked a place and said, boom, right here. And it was a meadow area, probably heavily populated by Miwoks, because let's face it, over decades they figured out the best places to live, climate-wise and everything, and water. And so he set up shop, and it became a very dominant central supply point for miners. And they would come in and get their supplies there. And
Now, when miners first came in,
okay.
when it first started,
Sure.
did they bring their families, or was it mostly just the men?
No, just the men.
Okay.
Yeah. Women were the exception.
Yeah.
And so that was definitely the case. Slowly there was a trickling coming in. I know there was a school set up, and a lady teacher of that school within the first 5 years of its history, which was kind of unusual. But they probably didn't have a lot of students quite yet. But it was already forming all those little elements of a town where you have a school and you have a constable and you have all these other little things that you set up in time. And they were all pretty much in place by 1860 in West Point. So, and you had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Chinese laborers. You had large contingencies of South Americans. And they were very good miners because they were used to mining in South America, and numerous mines that were down there. And they were very proficient. There's still a number of mining sites named that are Spanish in that region.
Do you have information on, like, how the main miners lived, and then how the Chinese would live? Did they live in the same kind of housing? How was that?
Quite a bit of variance there. So the Chinese had a tendency to live in clusters, and there were several clusters on Main Street on West Point that was considered the Chinese sector.
Oh,
In fact, my house is on China Spring Lane, and the spring was one of those things where they carved out wood pipes, and it ran from house to house
oh.
down the street on Main Street, West Point, according to the story I read. Wow. And they would bring in their favorite foods and their opium dens and all the things that were their culture. Those places were burned out several times, and but it was a fairly dominant thing. Back in those days, there were a number of laws passed against anyone who was judged to be you know, not quite European white guy. And so there were laws passed that inhibited the Chinese, inhibited the South Americans from being miners. And so you saw an awful lot of pressure on what you call the West Belt, which is along Highway 49, that being a very dominant gold mining region along 49. Well, West Point was called the East Belt, and there was less pressure on it because it was further up the hill and harder to mine, not quite as rich, and therefore minorities had a much easier time prevailing there. And so that's why you see such a mix of cultures at West Point.
So did when did like West Point when did people from West Point begin to like make travels for whatever reason to like San Andreas or Mountain, you know, to the
Yeah, there's no question in the day that getting from any place else was quite a chore. If you were trying to, McConnell Hill was a dominant center along 49. That if you tried to get from Oak Hill to West Point, you had to go through the south branch of the McCallamy River, and that canyon is just horrible and was very, very difficult for a wagon or anything. The one that went over, the trail that went to Volcano was quite steep, but was actually more manageable, and there was an awful lot of gold that came out of the West Point region that actually ended up being assayed out of Volcano as if it was Amador County gold, but it really wasn't. It was really West Point gold, and so it was easier to go that way. And getting to San Andreas was it was difficult through Railroad Flat. You could do it, but it was an awfully difficult passage to get down there. At least in the first 10, 20 years of the gold rush. Later on, they formed road associations and the like, and eventually many of the bridges up there were all privately owned, so that you paid a little toll to a guy who kept the bridge up. Well, eventually counties took over the bridges, and many of them were kind of skeletal metal structures in the old days. And then starting in the 1930s and 40s, they became cement structures and more permanent.
I suppose they had their own doctor in the area or somebody that could treat if there was an emergency or something, so they didn't really have a lot of reason to travel.
Well, West Point's first doctor was a Dr. Fisher.
Okay.
So, and my property is the original Dr. Fisher homestead at West Point.
Oh, really?
So Dr. Fisher came to West Point after first setting up a practice at Moke Hill. I mean, within the first year of the gold rush, he had come over as like in his young 20s as a doctor from Germany and set up his practice and was doing great. But he saw that there was another kind of boom going on starting up at West Point by 1853, and he decided, I'll see what I can do up there. And he was one of these guys that while he was a doctor, which in those days I think were primarily handholders more than anything else, he used his money very wisely to buy up claims, properties, water systems, and so he really became a real center of commerce.
Yeah.
And when he built the place that I have today, I think he got the claim on it in 1855, and he built the house and the barn in 1859. He only had it for about 3 years, and he bought something else. He was, like I say, he was always jumping around that way. But on the deed, when he sold it, and it was handwritten, and I have a copy of it, it listed, you get this claim, and you get this lumber mill, and you get this, and it listed all the things that went with the sale to this gentleman. And it was interesting to see how many things he'd consolidated.
Oh, wow.
But he would buy, he had an offspring with a Miwok woman there. And today, the Fisher Trust Lands for Miwoks, which was formed in the 1920s, is still there, and their descendants.
Oh, very interesting.
See?
Yes.
And like I say, I talked with them, the families there, and gotten their histories and are part of my collection. And they know, and they've come over to visit when I was restoring a stone and wood barn, which the doctor built with his carriage bays for his carriages to go to his patients and like. So I restored that first, and then some of the fascia on that was soapstone. Well, I took a piece of the soapstone and cleaned it up and put a note with it that this was from Dr. Fisher's original part of his original barn. He gave it to the Miwoks as a memento.
Yes.
That live up there. So
So fascinating. He was an unusual doctor then.
yeah, he was quite the guy. By now, but he did end up getting married, having a son, and returning to Germany by 1870,
Oh, really?
and was gone.
Oh, wow.
And I've never been able to get a line on him otherwise.
Yeah.
You know,
That is so.
there's always pieces of the story you wish you had,
Yes.
but you never get them all.
Well, how did you come to the West Point area? Your family history that brought you personally there.
Well, apparently, I'm fifth generation, and 4 family names that are common to West Point are in my background. So the first relative I really have in West Point is very early on, like 1855, 1856, by the name of Rufino from northern Italy, who comes as a merchant.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
he comes as a merchant, and by 1870, a blacksmith who is from Scotland by the name of Smith is working in Angel's Camp, and he buys out the blacksmith at West Point. And his name was John Smith. And his brother had come over after him, and he had been working in the gold fields, mostly along Highway 49. His name was Thomas Smith, and he came up to visit him, and in those days you could pile of rocks 4 places and file a claim, or a trust deed. You went for a trust deed, and you had to do a few dollars worth of improvements. And so that's how my great-grandfather got his lands up there. But I'm jumping ahead a little bit here. So Rufino, he has his store in town, and a guy named Wilson's coming through town, and he's just looking for his fortune, you know, what the heck. And I could use a clerk. Okay, I'll become your clerk. You know, he becomes the store clerk. But after about 7 or 8 years, you know, this bachelor, he just kind of feels sorry for him. So he sends for his sister. Rufino sends for his sister back in northern Italy there, very close to the French border.
Okay.
And she comes over, and they probably can't exchange any words, but it's a marriage. So it's all put together, yes. Yeah, everything's fine. And because they don't have any money or anything, I mean, they're fairly poor, they go out to Bummerville, which is a mile outside of town, where there's a number of hard rock mines had been located, and they would build small cabins for the miners. But when these mines would go through hard times, they would shut down, and all those cabins would... Well, it turns out that you could go out to Bummerville and get your house. So in this particular case, there had been a bar near the mine, and so they went up there and cleaned out the bar, and they lived there for the next 20 years. And had 2 kids, had 3 kids, had 3 kids. So, and one of them was my grandmother. So that's how Wilson, and eventually the Wilsons were given the Fisher place. sold it out of the family, and I bought it back. Anyway,
That is
so all these
wonderful.
are. So there's Rufino there, marrying Wilson from Italy. There's Wilson, who's English, out of the Connecticut area, who just as a kid came out to get his fortune. So Wilson's Rufino. There's Smith, who shows up because his brother moved up there for the blacksmith store, and he's a miner. Had been a very successful mine foreman, because he came to this country with a lot of mining experience in Scotland, probably mostly coal, I think. And he, like I say, he goes into the Teamster business, decides to get out of mining, which means he's really hauling a lot of ore to crushers in the area, and then going down and getting supplies for the miners to feed the general stores and other like in town. So then you have, that's where the Smith comes in. And Thomas had 3 boys, and one was Judge Alex Smith, who was historically, I guess he had the title bestowed upon him of Mr. Calaveras.
Oh.
And there's a plaque to him in the old
really?
courthouse as Mr. Calaveras, because he had done so much to I think help the town, help the county record its history and help people's families and things. He was a pretty good politician, to say the least. He was a pretty good politician.
Yes.
And in fact, I remember he actually managed the manpower drives for World War I and II.
Oh, really?
Wow. I mean, when you looked for the guy to kind of lead the unusuals,
yes,
and patriotic things, okay, here comes Judge Smith. And then Thomas Smith married a Reynolds girl, and that family is obviously, and they had a long time presence there in West Point, running the systems and other things. So I have that name, and there's a marriage between the Smiths and the Porteouses. Porteouses are another big family in West Point.
Oh, okay.
So what happens when you're in a community like that? Well, Bill married Susie, and
Yeah.
And a lot, and so a number of people around today, when I see them, I just go, "Hi, cuz," even though it's really distant. Might be really distant. We all call each other cousin. But at any rate, that's kind of a summary of how I came about putting the collections together. I had some time on my hands in the mid-90s where I really did, by picking my dad's brain a lot, how I might find phone numbers and where descendants might be located and things like that. And then I actually went out of state when necessary just to retrieve people's collections from West Point. And so I've been real fortunate to get as much together as I have. There are notable exceptions to my collection. I've never had a picture of Chinatown in its day in West Point. And wouldn't that have been a delight to have had a picture of all the Chinese houses all lined up and all the merchants out in front of their stores or things like that? It would have been kind of a treat to have had a picture of it, but none survived that I know
That
of.
is something. Yes.
Yeah.
That is so awesome.
Another question that I was asked about was, there's a monument at West Point
Oh, yes.
that was put up under the direction of Judge Smith
Ah, okay.
in cooperation with a state program of landmarks that they put out throughout the state. And you see them places. They're mostly large brass plates. They're put up and they have a small story, this was this in a day. And he got a number of them placed in the county. And there's a not very nice one at Railroad Flat that I know of, and there's one at West Point. Well, the interesting one at West Point is, well, one, it's in front of his dad's house. So that's an interesting place to put it in front of his dad's house, okay? Then it goes on to tell a little story, of which I don't think any of it's right. So it starts off, West Point was one of the early gold rush mining camps. It was actually one of the last.
Oh,
It wasn't the earliest, it was one of the last
wow.
of the gold rush camps that were set up in that region. Um, Another part of it is that Mark Twain stayed there and wrote books and stuff. Didn't happen. Kit Carson came through, and that's why they called it the West Point, because of it was on his travel maps that this was a westerly point or something. That's not true either. So you have all these little references to historical figures and things. And, let's just say embellishment was the norm. A good story is worth at any rate. But West Point does have a, it doesn't have a spectacular history in the sense of world-renowned figures coming through like that. It's too bad he actually had to do that, but, I think that was the norm in those days, is to make things colorful.
Yes.
But West Point did have a very prosperous early history of surface mines in the various streams and places and gravels, and then a very storied history of hard rock mines where they would go down in shafts and recover a lot of gold that way. Many of the mines there would eventually prove not economical because mining is kind of a thing of so much gold per ton. So if you're moving a ton of rock, you kind of want so much gold out of that when you crush it to pay the bills and make money. And a number of mines found that they just were on the edge or quit. And one exception to that was there was a champion mine about a half mile outside West Point that old man Ruffino grub staked. Well, it went down 1,000 feet, paid really high, and completely stopped.
Why?
The gold just ran out. It was in that vein. It just went to a nothing.
Wow.
And the next thing you know, he sold the store and moved to San Francisco and bought an apartment up there, and and it was probably living the good life. His wife and his daughter. But his heart really was in West Point, and he still had a house there. And so I have all these pictures of him. He's back in West Point because San Francisco wasn't that much fun for him. And I think that goes back to the thing of how people establish associations with friends and things like that. And all of a sudden you go to a new town, you don't know anybody, and you go, well, this is kind of exciting, but I don't have anybody to talk to.
Yeah.
So he actually came back up until his final days and pretty much stayed around West Point.
Well, the land is so beautiful there.
Yeah.
So
And I did go to Murel, Italy, where he came from. I actually visited there I had occasion to give a speech in Zurich, Switzerland a few years back. And then I got on a train and went down to Milano and over to Savona, and then up into the hill country. And I thought I was in West Point.
wow.
Yeah. So this Italian family actually came from an area that looked just like West Point.
Amazing.
in the hill country there.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, could you go into the Miwok families? What can you tell us about
Well,
the Miwok in that area?
What you had is a situation where very early on there was Miwoks were treated terribly. There's no other way to look at it. You start with the Spanish period that came into California. There was tremendous abuse of them as essentially slave labor and the like in the mission system. And many of them just died. And of course, disease was a big factor because they had no natural immunity to diseases that were common in Europe and the like, and we had immunities to. Then you have that period ending, and between then and the gold rush, there was actually some very devastating malaria episodes in the Central Valley that wiped out, So when you had over 300,000 Native Americans in California to start with, you were down to, a third by then. And then you bring the gold rush in and the abuses that took place there, and you, in some cases, you just shot them. And in other cases, they just used them as slave labor and the like. So it was an awfully rough period. Miners would marry Miwok women or take them in, and then the descendants would have the white guy's name. And so that's and that was very common. So that's why the Fisher name carried on, because they didn't keep the Miwok last name. They kept the white guy's name. And there were a number of families that carried on from those descendants of those marriages that remained. The Cummins family was another one, Fisher, and there are a number of other families that remained in the area that were primarily descendants of these mixed marriages. Another notable one is a Carleton family. There was Carleton came in very early on. He had come out of Europe, gone to Mexico, had been mining in Mexico when the gold rush came, jumped on a ship, came up, jumped out of the ship in the harbor in San Francisco, swam to shore. Him and his buddy got up here to West Point, did a claim right off the bat. A hunting party was coming through from Nevada of Native Americans, and they traded for one of the girls, and that became Mrs. Carleton. And the family is still at West Point.
Oh, wow.
Today.
Wow.
At least two descendants are still reside in West Point today, the Carletons. But the original mother back in those days was from a tribe in Nevada that came over. And so that, like you say, there were not a lot of we would call white women. And it was, there was a lot of just that kind of marriages and relationships.
So in those days, the early days, the mixed marriages were accepted. Then
very common.
Yeah, they weren't looked down on.
No, that was very common.
Yeah. That's amazing. Okay. Okay. What are some unusual stories from back in the day? You're so great at telling us stories. Do you have some other stories
I'm trying to think if there's anything of particular note that would, and it didn't have any what you'd call huge colorful events that maybe some communities can claim. There's no question it had a number of very serious fires, and that was fairly common in the old days. You didn't have regular fire departments and the like. A lot of things were built out of wood. There was a very serious fire in 1865 that burned much of the town down. Resulted in the formation of the first hook and ladder company of West Point.
Oh, really?
So the West Point Fire Service has a history that goes back to 1865, although I remember seeing a picture in the 1930s of the dilapidated firehouse that had no engine, I don't even think it had hose by then. Today it has a fine fire service, so those things vary. But
this big fire, do you know what started it?
No, it didn't say in the account, just that there had been a fire in one of the commercial buildings, and then it went from building to building.
Oh.
And it was in those 1860s that then when they rebuilt, they often came back and they used adobe bricks that they would make on site, and then put up iron doors. And they were called fire safes.
Oh, okay.
And they had a wood floor and a wood ceiling. But they thought because the walls wouldn't burn and the doors and windows wouldn't burn because of all this iron, that we don't have a fire problem anymore. Well, when they had a fire, it burned the floor, it burned the ceiling, and everything else burned. The only thing standing was the wall and the doors. Didn't change anything else. So it was a nice try. But you'll see buildings here near Court, on Court Street here in San Andreas that utilize the same iron doors and brick construction
Yes,
and like.
yes.
You'll see it became quite common, even though it later turned out to not be very effective. But you still see structures of that type in West Point.
Yes. I've also seen those doors, I'm pretty sure the ones you're talking about in Columbia.
Yes, very common there.
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
And like I say, they had a fire, a very serious fire in West Point in the 1930s that burned out all those.
Wow.
Well, they came back and put a new floor and
Yes.
ceiling in, and
Yes.
they're still there. So,
So, these miners, were there a lot of young, like teenager boys and stuff that would come? Or were they mostly older men or middle-aged? Tell us something
you know, all
about
the
miners.
pretty primary stories I know about are people primarily in their 20s.
Oh, okay.
You know, prime of life, be able to take the hardships. You really don't have, until the 1860s, do you have people being able to come by train, because remember, you're only building the Transcontinental Railroad so that it becomes effective by 1870s. Most of my relatives came into New York before there was Ellis Island, and then got on ships and went to Panama, hiked and rode donkeys to the other side, and got on ships and came up to San Francisco. So that's how most of my relatives got here, you know. So I have that. But Ellis Island and some of that immigration system really wasn't in place on the East Coast until 1880s, 1890s. So, and the gold rush was well before that. So, and so you could just come to this country and nobody was at the door. You just, okay, here I am.
Were there any, you know, like mining accidents or something for the people who like to hear about this dangerous adventure? Anything?
You know, I don't know of any mine collapses or that type of thing that took place at West Point. I do know that one of the old characters who, a guy named Cavan, who ran the Old Timers Bar in West Point. Well, when he first got to West Point, it was about 1890s. He was working in a local mine, and down the shaft, somebody dropped something, it broke his arm. So he was never able to use his arm again.
Oh.
So he became a bartender in a bar. So, I mean, you do what you can do, I guess.
Yes.
And it was very interesting because his family, his daughter, then wrote essentially a diary history of their coming to West Point in the 1890s, where they came from, what families they lived with in Bummerville, where you got your house because it was the abandoned shack. So there was no homeless, because everybody go out there and get a shack.
Now, how far is that from West Point?
About 1 mile. So,
Oh, okay.
so I mean, it was a very nicely built-in system of, we take care of the next generation, you get a house, you know, even if it's a little small shack.
Yeah.
But,
So is that area kind of today like one big area since it's so close? Or?
well, you know, it had two dominant, very productive hard rock mines, and one of them was actually revived back in the 1950s, 1960s for a while. But again, it's the production on hard rock mines in that area was always such that by the time they really assayed it out, it didn't quite cover the bill. You know, because you're not going to spend $20 to get $20 worth of gold, and then you don't make anything over the cost of doing it, right?
Yes, yes.
And so when that one shut down, all the shacks and the headworks and all those things were removed. So it's just kind of an open field now.
Yeah.
You know, there are several mines where the mine headworks where the mine, ore car would have come up, and a crushing machine would exist, and then a mercury bed would have processed and pulled the gold out, and an air compressor maybe was over here to use for the drilling and all that. There are several sites still in the West Point area that are intact.
Oh.
But they've actually, in recent years, some of them have been, they were on like federal mine claims, and people went and stripped them.
Oh.
And which is tragic, because all that historical equipment and everything just ended up in a scrapyard for a couple of bucks instead of staying in place. But I still know of a couple mines that are still intact, but not too many. They're getting less and less.
Yeah. So these mines, are people going in there looking for gold?
No, not anymore.
That's kind of
not
done
anymore. No, those days are kind of over. People do come up and doing the streams now and then, and I see people with divers and stuff. But even that is today, as a result of fish and game restrictions, are highly restricted, because you can destroy the beds for fish to reproduce and the like by creating a bunch of silt and other problems in rivers. So that now is more regulated, and you don't see so much of the divers in the water anymore.
Yes. There's a cemetery in West Point.
Oh, yes.
What can you tell us about the cemetery?
Well, the cemetery, it's interesting. When I bought the Fisher place back in 2008, there was a grave on it.
Oh.
And I thought, oh, well, I guess the guy who lived here just went out and back and jumped in the hole, and that was it, you know. Well, it turned out I never was able to figure out who was buried there, but I did. It had a little picket fence around it, and I put the fence back up and did that for him. But the grave, there is a boot hill at West Point, we'll call it, and it turned out that I kind of looked through it to see who might be the oldest grave up there. Well, it turned out to be a lady that in 1853, when the town's first year, she had come over from Volcano and set up a boarding house for miners on a corner lot right there across the street from that little Italian store. So it was the second place built there.
Okay.
But back in those days, a lot of times you used local springs, and you would dig shallow wells and things like that for your water. And well, you also had all these outhouses that for the people, as more and more people were showing up, and you had no sanitation systems or anything like that. Well, waterborne diseases were becoming more and more common, taking people out. And by, I think, around 1958, after about 4 years, she passed away. And she is the oldest dated grave in the West Point Cemetery.
Yes.
But it showed you that it was real perilous whether you stayed healthy or not in those gold rush towns in the day, because your water supplies and all these other things are very easily contaminated, and you had to be pretty smart about it to avoid not getting. And I know people who died of that kind of thing even after 1900, because you really don't have what you would call really sophisticated systems guarding water and sewer systems and that kind of thing until after 1900.
Yeah. So
the graves in the place, some of them are very decorative. You can tell families took a lot of pride in sometimes their descendants and put up very nice monuments. And I've traced a number of the names back to early merchants and things like that. So you can kind of, from my other story books that I got from some, I can find that they did get buried there. A few are buried down at McCallamy Hill, and a few we don't know where they are. So, but the original old, we'll call it the original old section, that, like I say, started very, very early on. Was expanded as a result of the John Smith family deeding over land so they could expand, because it was next to their land. So the Smiths deeded over land so that they could expand the cemetery. So today it's a very active site where families and descendants come, and here's my great-grandparents, and there's my parents, and you'll find 3 and 4 and 5 generations all in their areas up there. And it's very inexpensive, and it works out just really nice for the old families to come back and catch up. And every once in a while I catch somebody that is actually related to me or something like that as they come through, and we'll have a nice chat.
Yes.
It's kind of nice. But like I say, there are a number of very attractive monuments from some of the early settlers and the like. And then we also do a good job, I think, of taking care of current generations and Miwok families and the like. They have areas that we dedicate to them, and so you try and be
So
sensitive.
they have their area, and then did the Chinese have their area also, or?
Well, that's a good point. So what the Chinese would do is they would bury the deceased and wait until it was just bones. Then they would dig up the bones and put them in a big jar.
Oh.
Then they would take the big jar and ship it to China. No one was to be left here.
Oh, amazing.
Everyone was to be taken back to China. So when the last few Chinamen died in West Point, they got so far as to get in jars, but they never got out of town.
Oh, no.
So I'd heard stories where there was just a small covering over these jars, and kids used to go up there and play with the bones and stuff. I guess in the old days, when I got a skull, a Chinaman.
Oh, no.
Well, at any rate, what we did finally is we put a nice cement covering over it, and indicating that these, and put lettering on it that these were Chinese graves, and covered over where these 3 very large urns are.
Oh, awesome.
Are actually,
Yeah.
and so we have our own little Chinese section that
Awesome.
that resulted because there was nobody to send them home.
Yeah. Is this close to the other cemetery? Is
Well, it's in the old section.
Oh, it
It's
is?
just right part of there,
Yeah.
everything else, yeah.
Oh, wonderful.
Not separate or anything, just part of the old section.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Kirk, you've collected all these boxes of information,
Right,
letters, journals.
right.
What story is burning to tell? What have we missed that you would just love to tell?
Oh, that's hard to say. That's hard to say. I haven't given that a lot of thought, so.
Okay.
But there's no question the story of West Point is one of people who over time developed attachments and family relationships and other things, and carried on generation after generation after generation that still have a presence there. And I think that's the thing that binds a lot of people to these areas, even when there's not strong economic activity anymore in some of these regions that were originally quite active as a result of mining and then subsequently timber. Mm-hmm. But the last timber mill closed in West Point in '62. Mm-hmm. And I remember as a kid sleeping at night, you could hear a hiss boom, which was the carriage going back and forth in the mill at Wilseyville. And so you, all night long, you would hear the hiss boom of the carriage going back and forth from steam power and things like that. But that era then ended. So, I mean, there was a lot of eras that still had economic, what I would call engines. Mm-hmm. Today, it's much more of a retirement community. And there's no question that the land value and a nice, attractive location are its main values today to people. Yes. Would I like to think there's a resurgence somewhere out there? I would hope, but I don't know what that would be. Mm-hmm. We have some very unique challenges now with climate change and the threat of wildland fire to mm-hmm. communities. Yeah. And the insurance issues that result from that. That's a very difficult deal to deal with. Mm-hmm. There are a number of counties in California that are projected to actually contract population-wise over the next 20, 30 years, and Calaveras is one of them. So you never know whether something's going to come along and all of a sudden, oh, well, that'll revitalize that.
Yeah.
But let's face it, for areas to have economic swings is a reality of many places in the United States
Yes.
today.
Yes.
Be it industries move on or change, and communities go through, we grew and then we contracted, and it'll be interesting to see what West Point's future might be. But I wouldn't be surprised if it stays relatively sleepy for until somebody figures out something.
That sounds like a good conclusion, but I'm
Okay.
going to ask you a question that I'm hoping when they edit, you'll throw it earlier somewhere. I want to know about, okay, the log jamboree. Is there still a
Lumberjack Days, the Lumberjack
yes.
Days, yes.
Can you tell us about that?
A little bit. I haven't been really real closely associated with it. It started in the 1950s. It was a kind of thing where, it was kind of a local benefit type thing to celebrate that, they were now a lumber town, and they really were. They were very much a lumber town in after World War II.
Oh, okay.
For quite some time there. And there were enough people and merchants and other things that, you had a volunteer fire department and they wanted to be in the parade, and you got guys who wanted to show how good they could be to chop down a tree and buck it up with his chainsaw. And there was all those kinds of things, kind of macho things that guys decided, well, if we have this weekend that we do this thing, and then we'll have a big meal, we'll drink too much beer, and we'll just have a good time. And so that's how it kind of started. And everybody, and his mother and his dog walks down the street and waves at everybody.
Wow.
Throws candy and just has a good time. And
Am I correct? I think I heard there's some celebrities that's actually come to those events.
probably.
Yeah.
Couldn't tell you who. I couldn't tell you who, but yes.
Yeah.
But it's a fun gathering.
Awesome.
Go over and have a really nice meal at the fire department. And VFW Hall puts on a very nice meal, and
Awesome.
entertainment at the community garden.
Yeah.
There was a couple of professors out of Stanford who ended up living at West Point, and they bought an area that where the John Smith stables were.
Mhm.
Well, they converted it to a community garden and then donated it to the community. So
Oh.
this year they had a concert in there during the Lumberjack Days. So
Did they?
which adds to the entertainment factor.
Yes.
And they also have they usually try and dedicate some things just for kids to play on.
Mhm. Yes.
So they do a nice job. They do a nice job of it.
There's a real sense of community.
Yeah.
Everybody knows everybody and looks out for everybody in a way.
Yeah, and that's pretty typical small town America.
Yeah, I like that.
And you don't get that unless you're because if you live down in the city, you're lucky you know the guy next door.
True.
And
So true.
and so no, you know a lot more people, and when I take a walk, and I I'm in my 70s, and I like to take walks so I don't sit too much.
Yeah.
One of those things.
Yes.
Try and stay healthy. Yeah, I bet you I average 4 to 6 conversations with people before I get back to the house, and that's actually nice.
I think that's wonderful.
That
Yeah.
you have that sense of people who you know and greet you and bring you up to date on who's what and where, and just you need help with something, you talk about it, and maybe you go over later and help them fix their pipe or something.
That's wonderful.
So yeah, there's an element to small town America that
Yes.
you won't find anywhere else.
And I think you have your own little radio station, don't you?
There used to be regular programming out of a small office there on Main Street. That office is still there. I understand that much of the programming is associated with NPR
Okay.
and programs that are syndicated
Yes.
and the like. They used to do a custom music hour on the weekend where certain artists in the area would come in and say, well, these are my favorite tunes from,
yes.
you know, the Vietnam era, and you hear Clarence Clearwater Revival,
Yeah.
and you'd hear, you know, and it'd be, you know, they were kind of like fun concert times to listen to the station. I don't know if they're still doing those, but that was the idea, is to every once in a while have local programming.
Yes.
And I think they asked me to come in one time, and they wanted to, you know, like you say, ask me some questions about some local government issue, and so I did, you know,
Yeah.
that's fine. So if you can interject that type of local stuff into a programming format, you know, it makes it kind of fun for
Yes.
to have. Because one of the other things that really concerns me is that newspapers and things, that printed matter that traditionally were very important to communities and communicating what is going on, and both politically and economically and the like, are really struggling today in our current media environment. And so we're lucky to have Calaveras Enterprise and West Point News, because many communities have lost any connection through print matter and the like. There's no question, I guess social media and some of these other things are substituting to a certain degree. But I still think there's a loss of local communication through the printed matter, and I hope that the local newspapers and the like do everything they can to stay viable, because I think they really have a very valuable purpose in talking to people about current events and things that impact them, and giving them a sense of community and buy-in that you wouldn't otherwise get.
So let's finish up about your book. How is it coming?
Okay, well, when I first got into collecting stuff in the 90s, I thought I would write a book. And I found two others that had written books. A guy named Collins, who is doing his medical, in the day a doctor would come out of like a medical school at Berkeley or something like that. They would go to a rural community and simply practice for a few years, and that was their residency. Maybe under a doctor, maybe not at all. And he wrote a book after he left living in the West Point community, and I found that book. He went on to be a surgeon in San Francisco and retired in the Bay Area. But I found that book, and then the other book I found was one that was written by Art Wilson, and it was his kind of recollections of what it was like to grow up in West Point and interact with the Miwoks and the Chinese and all these different elements, and what it was like for a kid to go to a mine and all those things. Well, they actually used that book as part of the education program at the grammar school there.
Oh,
so that they give kids a sense of the history of where they live and everything.
neat.
So I thought, well, maybe I'll write a book. Well, so I started creating all these indexes. So I have an index of every name I've ever come across in written matter and the dates and what they did. Then I created another one for where all the gold mines were and the gold mine camps and where they were and who lived there and what was notable about them. And then I started one on lumber mills and logging operations, so that I have pictures of logging trucks that look like they're starting with no motors.
Wow.
One's just pulled by horses,
Yeah,
all the way
yeah.
up to ones that just have solid wheels, and they look like, they came out of some cartoon, but
Awesome.
at any rate. So I have all that, and then I have an events index, and it talks about, where all the buildings were in West Point and what they did, was housed there, whether that was a shoe shop in the old days or whether that was an assay office or that was the Wells Fargo office, and I have all that catalog. So once and occasionally I get little pieces that get added to it. People, in fact, somebody last night, a guy named Brian Smith, who's a distant relative, and we had a meeting, and he says, I have some more information for you on the Coffinberry families a contribution to the logging industry up here. And I said, oh, well, next time you come over to the house, we'll put that in the index. So every once in a while, somebody will contribute. But at some point, it really slowed down what I was finding. It's kind of like when I got the big collections, it gathered every book I could ever find. Well, I just never got around to writing a book. But I'm real glad that those collections are on computerized and turned over to the Historical Society, and they will live on for anybody who comes in and wants to research their family primarily. And that's one of the things that they primarily find themselves is people will come back to the area and say, well, I had this relative and he was born in West Point and his dad was, this. And could you look up what you have on him? And they find that people really enjoy finding that their connection to their families and what they did when their previous generations. Because not all families pass stuff down real well. So when the local historical societies and the like can be a party to that, everybody enjoys that. So that's, I think, the primary value of what I put together will be that people will be able to look it up and go, oh, so that was my uncle's store. And, that was my great-grandfather's this.
Oh, I think that's so wonderful.
So, yeah.
Well, hopefully there will be a book to develop and that can be sold in our area, and I look forward to being one.
Well, maybe.
Thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.